The sun hung low over the busy city street, bathing everything in a warm, golden light. Maya's delivery bag bounced lightly against her hip as she weaved through the crowd. Her shift was almost over, and this was the last package for the day. She could already imagine going home, taking off her cap, and sitting with a cup of tea. But fate had other plans. As she neared the last intersection, Maya spotted a group of bikers parked along the sidewalk. Their bikes gleamed in the sunlight chrome, polished to perfection. Black paint shining like wet ink, the loud laughter of the group carried over the hum of the street. Most people passing by gave them a wide berth. Maya didn't care. She'd been working these streets for months, and nothing had ever rattled her until that day. One of the bikers stepped forward as she approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather vest covered in patches. His helmet hung lazily from one hand, and his smirk was the kind that made people uneasy. "Hey, delivery girl," he called out, blocking her way. Maya stopped, keeping her voice calm. "Please move. I'm just trying to make a delivery." The man chuckled, glancing back at his friends. "She says, please, boys," he mocked. The others laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Maya shifted her weight, gripping the strap of her delivery bag tighter. Her heart was beating faster now, but she refused to show fear. "You're in my way," she repeated, her tone firmer. That's when it happened. Without warning, the man raised his hand and slapped her across the face. The crack of the hit echoed down the street, making people turn their heads. The sting burned across her cheek, and for a second, the world seemed to pause. A man across the street pulled out his phone, recording. A woman gasped, but didn't step forward. The other bikers roared with laughter. It was a public humiliation, and they were enjoying it. Maya didn't stumble, didn't cry. She slowly turned her head back to look at him. Her eyes were dark and steady. There was no panic, there only something cold and unshakable. "You'll regret touching me," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he and those closest could hear. Her words cut through the laughter. For a brief second, the biker's grin faltered. Then he barked another laugh, as if to shake it off. Maya stepped around him, brushing his shoulder with hers, and kept walking. The crowd parted for her, some staring, some whispering. She didn't look back. Inside, her cheek still throbbed. But her mind was already working not on revenge, not yet, but on the truth. Men like him thought they could do anything without consequence. They thought fear would keep people quiet. But Maya wasn't afraid. Not anymore. A young boy who had seen the whole thing ran up to her as she turned down a side street. "Miss, are you okay?" he asked, his eyes wide. Maya forced a small smile. "I'm fine, kid," she said. "Go home." The boy hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Maya's phone buzzed her boss, asking if the delivery was done. She sent a quick reply saying she was on her way, but as she walked, she could feel eyes on her, turning slightly. She spotted one of the younger bikers leaning against a wall, watching her. When he noticed her looking, he smirked and mouthed the words, "You're done," before disappearing into the alley. Her steps slowed. The slap had been public, but this was different. This meant they weren't finished. And that meant neither was she as she approached the final delivery address. Her hand brushed the edge of her cheek again. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every girl who had been pushed, slapped, or humiliated in the street while everyone else looked away. And in that moment, Maya made a silent promise. He would regret it, not out of anger, but because some lessons had to be learned the hard way. When she handed over the package to the customer, her voice was polite, steady, but inside, she was replaying the moment over and over. His smirk, the sting, the laughter, and with each replay, the resolve in her heart grew stronger. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to fight him right there. No, she would wait. And when she struck back, it would be in a way he'd never forget that night. As Maya walked home under the dim streetlights, she passed the same spot where it had happened. The laughter was gone now, replaced by the hum of the city at night. But she could still feel the echo of that moment in the air. She stopped for a second, looking at the empty sidewalk. Then she whispered to herself, "Karma's coming," and kept walking. The city never truly slept. Even at night, voices drifted from open windows. Streetlights buzzed, and the distant hum of engines rolled through the air. But tonight, it was a different kind of noise, a whisper spreading through the narrow backstreets. The story of the biker who slapped the delivery girl was on everyone's lips. Some told it with laughter, others with a shake of the head. And in the darker corners, people lowered their voices when they spoke Maya's name. Maya herself stayed quiet. She finished her shift the next day as if nothing had happened. But inside, her mind was sharper than ever. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the smirk, the arrogance, the way his friends laughed. She didn't want pity. She wanted him to remember her, not as a victim, but as the reason his pride shattered in one shadowy alley. Two teenage boys leaned against a wall, trading rumors. "They say she's got cousins who ride with the night crews." One whispered, "Night crews? Man, those people don't play around." The other replied, "They don't need to touch you twice, you learn your lesson the first time." The rumor grew with each telling. By the time it reached the biker gang, the story had twisted into something else entirely. Now they were saying Maya was connected to people who handled problems quietly. Vince, the biker who had slapped her, only laughed when he heard it. "Let her try," he said, knocking back a beer in the bar. They called home. No little delivery girl scares me, but the way his eyes darted toward the door told a different story. That night, Vince left the bar late. The streets were quiet. Only the faint sound of his boots echoing. His bike waited under a dim streetlight, sleek and polished like always. But there was something different. A small black feather was taped neatly to the seat. He stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening. He ripped it off and tossed it into the gutter, muttering under his breath. But as he swung his leg over the bike, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. A few streets away, Maya stood in the shadows, her delivery cap pulled low over her eyes. She watched him start the engine and ride off, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't need to follow. She already knew his routes. Every rider had habits, and she had been paying attention the next day. Vince's chain came loose in the middle of traffic. Cars honked, and he swore loudly as he pulled over to the side. His friends teased him about his bad luck. He laughed with them, but inside, something was gnawing at him when he got home. He found a second black feather, this time stuck to his apartment door. Meanwhile, Maya went about her day as usual to anyone watching. She was just another delivery girl weaving through the streets. But behind that calm face, she was collecting pieces she learned when Vince rode alone, which back roads he used, how often he checked his bike. She wasn't rushing. Revenge wasn't about speed. It was about precision. Her younger brother Liam noticed the change in her. "You've been quiet?" he said one evening as they ate dinner in their small apartment. "Just tired," she replied, though her mind was far away. Liam hesitated, then leaned forward. "I heard what happened, Maya. Please don't do anything stupid." She met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "Some people don't stop until they are stopped," she said simply. Liam sighed, knowing there was no changing her mind. In the following days, more whispers floated through the alleyways. One shopkeeper claimed he saw Maya talking to a group of men in black jackets. A street cleaner swore he saw her leave a package under Vince's bike, though he admitted it could have been nothing. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. What mattered was that fear was starting to creep in, and fear was something Vince wasn't used to feeling. One late evening, Vince sat at the bar alone. A couple of his gang buddies had gone home early, and the place was quieter than usual. He kept glancing toward the door. The bartender noticed, expecting someone. Vince forced a laugh. Nah, just keeping an eye out. But when the door finally opened, and it was only a drunk old man stumbling in, Vince exhaled, slowly relieved, but not entirely. Outside, Maya passed by on her bike, her face hidden under the shadow of her helmet. She didn't stop, didn't look inside, she didn't need to. The tension was building exactly how she wanted. She was no longer the girl who got slapped in the street. She was the shadow in his mind, the whisper he couldn't escape. By the end of the week, Vince's friends had started making jokes about the curse he'd brought on himself. Maybe you should apologize, one suggested half seriously. Vince scoffed. Apologize? To her? Never. But the way his hand tightened on his beer glass betrayed something else, something that looked a lot like doubt. And as the city lights flickered on, Maya sat in her small apartment. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of oil. Her eyes stayed on it for a long moment before she put it down on the table. She wasn't ready to act, not yet, but soon, very soon. The next morning, the streets looked normal. Buses hissed to a stop. Shopkeepers rolled up metal shutters, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery on the corner. But for Vince, nothing felt normal anymore. Every time he heard footsteps behind him, he turned to look. Every time a shadow crossed his path, his stomach tightened. Maya, on the other hand, moved like nothing had happened. She delivered packages, greeted her regular customers, and even joked with the old woman who sold flowers at the square. But behind her calm eyes, her mind was always working. She was patient, and patience was something Vince didn't understand. The whispers had done their job. People were looking at Vince differently now. Some smirked as he passed, others simply avoided him. And when a man's pride is built on fear and respect, those looks cut deeper than any wound. 3 days after the slap, Vince was cleaning his bike outside his small garage. The afternoon sun glinted off the chrome as he worked. That's when he noticed his rear brake cable was looser than it should be. Not broken, just touched. He stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight. Was it wear and tear, or something else? That night, he double-locked his garage for the first time in years. And yet, when he came back the next morning, a small black feather lay on the seat. It hadn't blown there by accident. He knew it, and the fact that whoever left it had been close enough to touch his bike without him noticing, that made his skin crawl. Meanwhile, Maya kept gathering information. She had mapped Vince's usual routes in her head, where he sped up, where he slowed down, which streets he avoided. She noticed he always took a narrow shortcut behind the market on Wednesday nights. The alley was too tight for cars and had no cameras. It was the perfect place. Her younger brother Liam kept watching her with worried eyes. Maya, this isn't you, he said one evening as they ate. It is now, she replied without looking up. Why? Because of a slap, he asked. She finally met his gaze, her voice steady. No. Because of what it meant. He thought he could humiliate me and walk away laughing. If I don't do anything, he'll do it again to someone else. Liam didn't argue after that. He knew when Maya made up her mind, nothing could pull her back. 2 days later, Vince was riding down the highway when his front light flickered. It wasn't enough to be dangerous, but it rattled him. He pulled over, checked the wiring perfectly. Fine. When he looked up, a delivery bike zipped past on the opposite side of the road. The rider wore a plain black helmet. But something in the tilt of the head made him think of Maya. He shook it off and laughed at himself, but his laugh sounded hollow, even to him. That night, Vince's friend Carl dropped by. Carl had been part of the gang for years and had seen Vince in a dozen fights, but tonight he noticed something different. "You're jumpy, man," Carl said, sipping from a beer. "I'm fine," Vince muttered. "Fine. You've been looking over your shoulder since I got here." Vince slammed his bottle down. "She's not going to scare me." Carl raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Vince didn't answer, but the silence said enough. Across town, Maya sat at a small table in her apartment. In front of her was a small bottle of thick black oil. She tilted it slightly, watching it roll inside. Her plan wasn't about rushing in. No, it was about making him feel the same helplessness she had felt in that moment when the slap rang out and no one stepped in. The fear, the humiliation, the sense that the world had turned against you. He needed to know that feeling. Over the next few days, she kept her distance. No direct encounters, no words exchanged, just the small signs to feather. The loose chain, the flickering light, each one was a whisper in his ear, a shadow at his back, and with each day, his confidence eroded just a little more. One rainy afternoon, Vince rode past the alley behind the market. The wet pavement glistened. Under the dim yellow street lamps, he didn't notice the faint tire tracks that led in. And somewhere deep in the shadows, Maya stood under her hood. Watching, not yet. She thought, soon, but not yet. That night, Vince couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building made him sit up. He kept replaying the moment in his head, her words. "You'll regret touching me." It had been days, but they still echoed as if she'd said them minutes ago. In another part of the city, Maya lay awake too. Not out of fear, but anticipation. The buildup was almost complete. Vince was like a rope pulled tight, just waiting for the final tug to snap, and she would be the one to pull it. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, small. Puddles reflected the pale glow of street lamps, and the smell of damp asphalt hung in the air. It was the kind of night when the city seemed quieter than usual, when even the stray dogs moved silently. Maya stood at the mouth of a narrow back street, her hands in the pockets of her dark jacket. Her delivery bike rested against the wall. Behind her, engine off, she had chosen this place for a reason: no cameras, no heavy traffic, no witnesses who might interfere. The shortcut between the market road and the industrial block was perfect. Vince always took it when he wanted to avoid red lights, and tonight he would take it again. She had prepared everything in silence earlier that evening. She'd slipped into the alley and poured a thin layer of oil mixed with water across the middle stretch. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make any bike lose control the moment the wheels hit it. She'd checked every detail twice. Now all that was left was to wait somewhere in the distance. She heard the faint growl of a motorcycle engine. It was a sound she'd learned to recognize. Vince's bike had a slightly deeper roar than most. She pulled her hood lower over her face and stepped back into the shadows. Meanwhile, Vince was in high spirits. He had just left a bar after a loud argument with one of his friends who had suggested he should let the whole thing go. Let it go? No way. Vince prided himself on never backing down. Still, as he rode through the city, he couldn't deny a small, nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He shook it off with a smirk, telling himself he was imagining things. When he reached the corner near the market, he automatically leaned into the turn that led to the narrow shortcut. It was muscle memory by now. The alley stretched ahead, dim lights, wet pavement, nothing out of place, but Maya was there, just beyond the first bend, unseen. She waited until he was almost at the slick patch. Her eyes never left the bike. The sound of the engine grew louder, the headlight beam slicing through the shadows. Then, in one swift moment, the inevitable happened. The front wheel hit the oil. The bike jerked violently to the side. The tires squealing, Vince tried to steady it, swearing loudly, but the wet surface gave him nothing to grip. The bike twisted under him, and the next second, it slammed down hard onto the pavement. Vince hit the ground with a grunt, pain shooting through his side. Before he could react, the heavy machine rolled just enough to pin his leg beneath it. The street went silent, except for the faint hum of the cooling engine. Vince groaned. trying to push the bike off him, but his leg was trapped at an awkward angle. Then he heard the slow, steady sound of footsteps approaching. Maya stepped out of the shadows, her hood still up. She didn't rush, didn't speak at first. Her boots clicked softly against the wet ground as she closed the distance between them. Vince froze. Recognition hitting him like a cold wave. "You?" He breathed, his voice tight with pain and something else uneasy. She stopped just beside him, looking down. "You put yourself here," she said calmly. Her voice carrying no anger, only certainty. Vince tried to laugh, but it came out strained. "This was you. You could have killed me." Maya crouched so they were eye level. "You slapped me in the street in front of everyone. You thought it was a joke. You thought I'd walk away and forget. I don't forget." He tried to shift, wincing as pain shot through his leg. "Help me up," he demanded, trying to sound commanding. But she only tilted her head slightly. "Do you still think it's funny?" she asked, her tone soft but sharp enough to cut. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, Vince had no quick answer. Maya's eyes flicked to the bike pinning him. She rested her foot lightly against the metal frame, not pressing hard, just enough for him to feel the weight shift. Vince sucked in a breath, his jaw tightening. "You're lucky I'm not what you think I am," she said, straightening, "because if I was, you wouldn't be leaving this alley at all." With that, she stepped back, disappearing into the shadows the way she had come. Vince shouted after her, his voice echoing off the walls. But the only response was the fading sound of her boots on wet pavement. Minutes later, another biker from his crew found him and helped lift the bike off his leg. When Vince tried to explain what had happened, the other man gave him a strange look, slipped on a wet patch. "You sure?" Vince didn't answer. He couldn't not without admitting the truth. Across the city, Maya sat in her apartment. Peeling off her damp jacket, her hands were steady, her heartbeat calm. It wasn't over yet. The real lesson had just begun. The heavy motorcycle lay across Vince's leg, its weight pressing down like a block of stone. The cold, wet metal dug into his skin through his jeans, and every small movement sent a sharp jolt of pain up his side. The alley was silent, except for the faint drip of water from a pipe overhead. His pride screamed louder than the pain. He wasn't used to being helpless, especially not like this. He had always been the one towering over others, laughing at their fear. But tonight, he was on the ground, pinned. And the last face he saw before the darkness of the alley swallowed her was hers, Maya's. Those eyes, calm and unshaken, were worse than any shout or punch. She hadn't yelled, hadn't cursed him. She'd just told him the truth. "You put yourself here?" Vince gritted his teeth and tried to push the bike again. But his hands slipped on the wet frame. The smell of oil and metal filled his nose, making him more nauseous. He was about to try again when he heard voices approaching. Two men from his biker crew rounded the corner, their headlights cutting across the scene. "Whoa, Vince!" One called out, killing the engine and jumping off his bike. "What happened?" "Slipped," Vince muttered quickly, not wanting to give them the real story. They rushed over, grunting as they lifted the bike enough for him to pull his leg free. The moment his weight hit it, pain shot through his ankle and knee. He stumbled, grabbing onto the wall. "You okay, man?" The second biker asked. "I'm fine," Vince snapped, more harshly than intended, but his friends exchanged a quick look. They'd never seen him shaken like this. "Need a ride back?" Vince hesitated, then nodded, leaving his beloved bike in the alley felt like another kind of defeat as they rode away. Vince kept glancing at the shadows along the street. Every dark corner seemed deeper, every alley narrower when they dropped him at his apartment. He muttered a quick thanks and limped inside without another word. Maya, meanwhile, sat in her small kitchen, sipping tea. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, but inside She replayed the scene in her head, the way his face had shifted. When he realized it was her. It hadn't been anger she'd seen there, it had been something closer to fear. She didn't need to touch him again. Fear was like a seed, and she had planted it deep. The next morning, Vince limped into the bar. Where his crew usually met, his ankle was swollen, but he refused to see a doctor. The others looked up as he entered. What happened? Carl asked, leaning back in his chair. Road was slick, Vince said shortly. Grabbing a beer and sitting down, one of the younger bikers snorted. Road's always slick when you don't know how to ride. The group laughed, and Vince's jaw tightened. Their laughter sounded too much like the laughter he and his friends had thrown at Maya that day. Now it was aimed at Iman. He hated it. Carl studied him for a moment. You sure that's all it was? Vince didn't meet his eyes. Yeah, he said, but even he didn't believe himself. That evening, Vince went back to the alley to retrieve his bike. The chain was still intact. A payay. But a single black feather lay on the seat again. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up. It was dry despite the damp air, meaning it had been placed there recently. He felt a chill crawl up his spine across town. Maya was finishing her deliveries for the day. She didn't smile much, but today, there was a small curve at the corner of her lips. She knew exactly what that feather would do. Wasn't just a sign. It was a reminder. Every time he saw it, he'd remember the slap, the alley. The feeling of being trapped, and the more he remembered, the smaller he'd feel over the next few days. Vince noticed something strange. People in the neighborhood had started looking at him differently, not with fear, but with quiet amusement. Someone at the gas station chuckled when he walked in. A shopkeeper smirked as he passed. He realized with a sick feeling that word was spreading not about the slap, but about him and in his world. Reputation was everything. It was no longer just a bruise on his leg. It was a crack in his image. And the crack was widening. One night, Vince sat alone in his apartment. The TV on, but the sound muted. His mind wouldn't stop replaying that moment in the alley, her calm voice, her steady eyes, her words. It was like she had flipped the power in their roles. She wasn't the one hiding anymore. He was. Maya didn't go looking for him. She didn't need to. She understood that humiliation worked best when it had room to breathe. And Vince's pride was suffocating under its weight. For her, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. She had been humiliated in public. Now he was living that humiliation every single day. And the best part? She didn't have to lift a finger to keep it going. By the time a week had passed, Vince was avoiding the alley where it happened. He took longer routes, even if they meant hitting more traffic. His crew noticed, but didn't comment, though. The smirks said they'd already guessed the man who had once strutted down the street, daring anyone to challenge him, now kept his head down, and Maya, from a distance, watched quietly. The lesson wasn't over yet, but it was working. That night, as she closed her apartment window, she whispered to herself, "Pride can crush harder than any weight." And somewhere across the city, Vince lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling every word of that truth. The city had a way of turning a story into a wildfire. One spark, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. The tale of Vince, the tough biker who ended up trapped under his own bike, was spreading faster than either he or Maya had imagined. No one told it the same way. Some said he'd been racing and lost control. Others claimed a woman had stepped into the alley and spooked him. But the most popular version was the cruelest, that the same delivery girl he had slapped had somehow brought him down. Vince hated walking into public spaces now. At the market, people's whispers seemed louder. At the gas station, the attendant smiled a little too wide when giving him change. At the bar, his own crew laughed at his expense, tossing around lines like, "Careful, Vince, there might be a puddle nearby," or "Better keep the ladies happy." brother, they ride harder than you on the surface. Vince laughed with them, but every chuckle felt like a blade twisting inside. Each joke reminded him of the one thing he didn't want to admit. They were right. He had been taken down, and worst of all, he had been powerless to stop it. Maya, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had happened. She still rode her delivery. Roots still greeted her regulars. Her younger brother Liam noticed the shift, though. "You've been calmer," he said. One evening, as she unpacked groceries, she smiled faintly. "Calm is good. Calm means you're done?" he asked, searching her face. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "Sometimes the best punishment is letting someone live with themselves." Vince tried to bury himself in riding again, but even that felt different. Every time he leaned into a corner, he remembered the slick patch of oil. Every time his engine roared, he heard the faint echo of boots on wet pavement. Her boots. It was like she had left a shadow over him that wouldn't fade. One night at the bar, Carl leaned across the table. "You know, man, you could just go talk to her." Vince scowled. "And say what?" "Say you messed up." Carl shrugged. "Apologize." "Clean slate." "Not happening." Vince snapped. Carl shook his head. "Then get used to people laughing, because this isn't going away in another part of the city." Maya was stopped at a red light when two teenage girls waved at her. She recognized them from the market. They had been there the day of the slap. One of them called out, "You're the one who stood up to that biker, right?" Maya didn't confirm or deny it. She just smiled slightly before the light turned green and rode off. But inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because people thought she was a hero, but because she knew the truth. And so did Vince by the end of the week. Vince started avoiding certain neighborhoods altogether. He told himself it was to save time, but deep down, he knew it was because of her. Because every time he saw a delivery bike, his chest tightened. And every time he passed a woman with a black helmet, he wondered if it was Maya. One rainy evening, Vince was at a corner store buying cigarettes when he heard laughter outside. A group of young men were talking, one of them holding his phone out for the others to see. On the screen was a blurry video of Vince's bike lying on its side. Vince trapped beneath it. The angle made it look worse than it had been. One of the men said, "She just walked away." "Man?" Cold. Vince froze, the cigarettes in his hand forgotten. It wasn't just a rumor anymore, was video evidence. And that meant the humiliation was no longer something whispered in dark corners, it was public. He left without buying anything, the sound of their laughter still ringing in his ears. Maya didn't know about the video yet, but when she passed through the alley one night, she saw Vince's bike parked far away from the slick patch. She didn't need to smile or gloat. It was enough to know the place still made him uncomfortable. Some scars weren't on the skin, they were in the mind. And those lasted longer. At home, Liam watched her as she sat quietly by the window. "Do you feel better?" he asked Maya. Thought for a moment before answering. "Better isn't the word," she said slowly. "I feel balanced." Liam frowned. "Balanced?" "Yeah," she said. "He made me feel small that day." Now he knows what that feels like for Vince. Every day felt heavier than the one before. He wasn't bleeding, he wasn't in a cast, but he was wounded in a way that didn't heal. The slap had been a moment of power for him. Now it was a chain around his neck, dragging behind him wherever he went. And though he wouldn't admit it to anyone, not even himself, he knew that as long as Maya was out there, somewhere in the city, he'd never feel as untouchable as he once did. That night, Maya locked up her delivery bag and turned off the lights in her apartment. Outside, the rain began to fall again. She stood for a moment by the window, listening. In her mind, she could still hear the echo of that slap. But now, it was joined by another sound. The thud of a heavy bike hitting the ground. Two sounds. Two moments. And between them, the balance she had been waiting for. The morning sun painted the streets in gold. Vendors were setting up their stalls. The smell of fresh bread and fried snacks filling the air. Life in the city went on as usual. But for two people, Maya and Vince, everything had changed. It had been weeks since the slap in the street. Weeks since the alley and the bike crash. The noise of the rumors had faded from the headlines. But the damage had been done deep, permanent. Maya pedaled through the neighborhood. Her delivery bag bouncing lightly, she passed the same corner where it had all begun. This time, the air felt different. The group of bikers that usually crowded the spot wasn't there, and the few who were present stepped aside quietly as she rode past. Their eyes didn't meet hers. It wasn't fear in their faces. It was respect, and that was more valuable to her than any apology across town. Vince sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his boots. He hadn't been sleeping well whenever he closed his eyes. The same images came, the sharp sting of losing control of his bike, the heavy weight pinning his leg, and her voice, calm but cutting. "Do you still think it's funny?" He had stopped going to the bar as often, stopped leading his crew on long rides, stopped showing up at the spots where people knew him. It wasn't just to avoid the jokes, it was because something in him had shifted. He had spent years building a name on intimidation. Now he felt it slipping through his fingers like sand. That afternoon, fate decided to cross their paths again. Maya was leaving a cafe after making a delivery when Vince turned the corner on foot. For a brief moment, both froze. The crowd moved around them, but it felt like the air between them had gone still. Vince's eyes flicked to her cheek where he had slapped her weeks ago. The skin was clear now, no trace of the mark, but the memory was alive in both of them. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You've got something to say?" she asked quietly. Her tone wasn't aggressive, was curious, almost challenging. Vince shifted his weight. "Just watch yourself," he muttered. It wasn't a threat. Not this time. It was more like a surrender. Then he walked past her, disappearing into the crowd. Maya didn't smile. But there was a calm in her chest that hadn't been there before. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need him to admit she'd changed him. She could see it in the way he carried himself, now quieter, smaller, more careful, that evening. Maya and Liam sat by the window as the city lights flickered on. Liam passed her a cup of tea. "So, it's done?" he asked. "Yes," she said, taking a sip. "No more." "Feathers," he teased. She chuckled softly. "No more feathers. He'll carry the last one in his mind forever." Liam leaned back. "You didn't hit him back. You didn't hurt him physically. But you still won." Maya nodded slowly. "Hurting him would have made me like him." She said, "This way, he'll remember every single time he rides that a girl he thought was nothing made him fall." Vince spent that night in his small apartment. The rain pattered softly against the windows. His bike sat in the corner, cleaned and polished, but untouched. He ran his hand over the seat absent-mindedly. It was the same seat where those black feathers had been left. He had thrown them away, but the memory stuck. Every ride, every alley, every stretch of wet pavement, it all carried her shadow. He knew the crew still laughed behind his back, but strangely, he didn't feel the urge to fight them over it anymore. The fight had gone out of him in ways he didn't understand. Days later, Maya was back on her route when she passed by a group of young girls playing on the sidewalk. One of them waved and called out, "We saw you ride past the bikers that day. You were so brave." Maya didn't stop, but she raised a hand in acknowledgement. She wasn't looking for fame or praise. She was looking for something else. The quiet knowledge that she had stood her ground, and she had gotten her balance back as the sun dipped below the skyline. Maya made her last delivery and rode home through the dim streets. She passed the alley where Vince had fallen, The puddles had dried. The oil had long since washed away. But in her mind, she could still hear the moment his bike slammed into the ground. It wasn't joy she felt, it was closure. Vince, on the same night, rode past that alley too. He didn't slow down, but his grip on the handlebars tightened for the first time in weeks. He admitted something to himself. She had beaten him. Not with fists, not with force, but with patience and precision. And that was a kind of power he'd never understood before. When the city finally went quiet, Maya closed her eyes. She didn't see the slap anymore when she thought of him. She saw the look on his face in the alley, the moment he realized she was in control. And that was enough. For her, the victory wasn't in making him fall. It was in walking away, knowing she could have done more, but chose not to. And that choice, that restraint, made her the strongest person in the story.